1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is coffee.
Yeah, it's for you. This is take it along, you've seen it already. Just this notion that system fits the Western value system, which is an interesting
From you? Oh, I see, I got that. I think it's way over there.
But this is not the first time this is issue where this is raised issue.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I was talking with Homegrown machine. Very good.
Yeah.
But values, at least in terms of presence. Just imagine how easy that's in the building that's next to the franchise. Just totally. I know that, that's what we should do, how much. This is like it's very.
Don't like what you said.
All right, good. I'll keep that in mind.
And you know, also because I've known him off and on.
Oh, really?
He's a right retired, so I've landed him and he made his way in that. Himself involved in projects and so forth. He's a sort of open personality. He's very like you. A good guy. And he's
But he was an American philosopher. I said, good. That's good to hear. Maybe you can introduce me. Is that him out there? That's it. I suspect that you're sitting right in the door.
I will, but the weather is
Where are you guys now? You're DC, right?
but the weather is so different. And I'm very involved.
I'd like to say they're apex workers. That's what I used to get my book. I don't know how to say that.
Well, used to, is he still?
No, he's a son of his. I appreciate that. And, you know, we're going to Well, Fred, I can tell someone similar to but in any event, I think it's very
He misses that. I mean, he knows more about your name than anybody else in he does yours.
well, in any event, we'll see. You sitting here? Somebody sitting here? Somebody sitting here?
Somebody's sitting in this seat right here.
Why don't we sit here? Maybe we get that guy to transfer down there.
Hello, good to see you.
Because I may be
That's excellent. Yeah, actually, you know, we did a major amount of our work on Germany.
Could I ask you to move over so I can take a
It's a UK, of course, Spain,
Because I was wanted to use the mouse.
and I had some really
Would this be
very
better?
interesting.
No, because I was hoping like it wouldn't bounce. That's okay.
That would be great.
Oh, yeah. Marcus Kerbel.
Fortunately, we had the carpet on.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a microphone.
Yeah, Marcus, he's now taking the Confederation.
PDI.
Yeah, yeah, he's a very good guy. I back in question.
Lovely work.
Try to, you know, dig deeper into the German scene. And Marcus even fought back
and great
to get us a contract with the Imperial Ministry to study.
And Charles, the father, had a session with.
We were pretty much killed off by
The true story.
yes, you know, this is yeah, the top people were eager to do it.
The litigant was somebody called Mr.
But then the bureaucracy didn't like the idea
Blacker than that statue.
of US think tank messing around. And he showed up, they threw over this one and they report.
The defendants in the
So we
dock.
did everything possible,
The back of the
everything
back of the
return and they had to be, you know, they had.
And he was wearing a mask.
They,
Opened up his back.
and then we had, yeah,
Everybody was crazy. Working great.
stayed all night, meet there at night, and
Check around.
emailed them, took them proposal.
Three things too far.
Take a look.
And we FedExed the paper.
You just can't move your side around.
And that was in his obituary.
Yeah, just noticed that there were sort of splitting through 4 chairs.
Yeah, well, there wasn't really a way to put it even, and I had to put it closer here because I can't move the camera further this way. There's only one plug works,
Continuous dialogue.
which I thought we had gotten the other ones working, but apparently not.
So which ones? Thompson was waiting on those to work, or was it somewhere else?
Oh, that's very good. That's very interesting. Because I noticed the work that I'm interested in doing is on English. Oh, this is my wife,
I'm not sure exactly.
and this is Martin.
I think they were like fixing something else when I was using it.
Power plant for a long time.
They were fixing the HDMI cable, but we don't use it that way anymore. We used to plug directly into the wall, but we don't. So they didn't actually need to fix the HDMI.
Because now we're just going with that guy. That's good.
And then he went to France. So
Also, we're having an interesting dialogue. Are we going to start?
yeah, I'm gonna
Oh, yes.
where do I?
What subject?
In the middle here?
Well, the whole notion of requirement for a large army as a foundation.
Oh, of course, no, I'm sure you're agreeing with everything I say. Thank you.
But he put me on to one of his guys, thinking, we had really quite a useful discussion for about 2 hours.
Glasses.
I really like these comments.
Green flags.
Lucy last year.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IISS US. My name is Bryce Campbell. I'm the Managing Director of ROPS here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to, I think, a very fascinating discussion, and unfortunately a timely one, given the recent events across Europe. With us today, we have two distinguished speakers. The first will be Dr. Angel Rabasa from the RAND Corporation, where he's a senior political scientist. After many public years of service at the State Department of Defense. He writes extensively on the issues of extremism, terrorism, and insurgency. He is the co-author of the recently released book, Euro Jihad, if you want to hold that up for our audience, Patterns of Islamist Radicalization and Terrorism in Europe, which came out just this fall, which is timely as it is, of course, disturbing that we're talking about that so much. His previous publications covered everything from the Mumbai terrorist attacks to the rise of radical and political Islam in East Africa, Turkey, and Southeast Asia, among others. In addition to his completed research on patterns of Islamist radicalization and terrorism in Europe, Angel is currently focusing his research on the de-radicalization of Islamist extremists. To his left is Dr. Jackson James, who is the long-standing president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. And he has, for a very long time, been engaged on issues of German-American affairs in numerous capacities on both sides of the Atlantic. Before joining AICGS, he served as Director of Program Development at the University Center for International Studies at the University of Pittsburgh for a few years. Jack has lectured throughout Europe and the United States and has published extensively on issues dealing with Germany, German-American relations, and transatlantic affairs. He is also, of course, a very active member of the IISS, so we welcome him here as well. So the format for today, Angel will speak for about 15 minutes, giving you a summary of both his recent research and addressing some of these issues. We'll give Jack about 10 minutes to respond as a discussant, and then we'll turn it over to the floor for questions and answers. So with that, hand it over to Angel.
Well, thank you. First of all, Bryce, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak here. And I had written here that I wanted to thank the audience for braving the inclement weather that fortunately did not turn out to be so inclement. So never trust the weather forecasts. Actually, this is not the first time that I briefed IISS on this subject, because I recall several years ago I briefed the headquarters, the office in London, on sort of an earlier stage of the research. In fact, this book that you mentioned has been about 10 years in the making. I mean, not 10 years continuously, because the way we work in RAND is, you spend some time on a project, then you move to another project, then you come back. But I never gave up on this business of the what we call the Euro Jihad, because it kept so fascinating and so complex. And we finally completed it last about 6-7 months ago. And of course, this is one of those subjects that could go on forever, because there is always new information that you have to process. So theoretically, this could be just an infinite project, but we finally put an end to the research and published it. And as you mentioned, came out at a very timely point, because if you were to consider the jihadist landscape, so to speak, in Europe a year ago, you would have thought, well, the worst is over. And then you would have said, it's subsiding. The last major successful terrorist event in Europe prior to this year was the London bombing. That was 2005. So the interest, and of course, our administration has proclaimed that Bin Laden was dead and Al-Qaeda was the bombings. So no one would have, I think, paid so much attention. Then all of a sudden, in the last, I would say, beginning around June of last year, the whole issue has come back with a vengeance. And so now we have a situation, in my view, that the West not Europe, the United States, Australia has terrorist attacks. Muslim countries also are facing a greater terrorist threat than at any point since 9/11. So this is what we'd like to do here again is to try to understand this growing threat of homegrown terrorism in Europe. And of course, that's the subject of this discussion, how to respond to this threat. The latest turn of events that fortunately we were able to capture in the book is the emergence of Syria as a major theater of armed conflict for Western jihadis. And there are more foreign fighters, far more foreign fighters in Syria at this point that were at any point during the conflict in Afghanistan and the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And this, of course, poses very serious threats to the security of Western countries. We had also the terrorist attacks in Paris earlier this month. But the point of the book is that the sources of radicalization in Europe go far deeper than the current situation in Syria and Iraq or the plots that may be hatched by Al-Qaeda affiliates. Since I'm very limited in time, I usually need about 45 minutes or so to give justice to the findings, but I would like to summarize very briefly some of the key findings of the study. We can discuss them later in the discussion period. And some of them might seem counterintuitive. For instance, one is the relationship between the integration or lack of integration of Muslim communities in Europe and the propensity for radicalization. And this is a very important question because by and large, and some of you might challenge me on this, Europeans see radicalization in the context of the broader social problem of integration of the continent's Muslim communities. Whereas Americans tend to see it more in terms of the terrorist threat itself. And indeed, there is a valid argument that integration is a good thing because it promotes social cohesion. However, what we found is that the risk of radicalization is only weakly related to the integration deficit of Muslim communities in Europe. In fact, many of those involved in violent Islamist extremism were individuals who on the surface appeared to be well integrated, were well educated, some had professional jobs, but turned against the countries where they resided. There is also, beyond that, a very weak or no correlation between poverty and radicalization. And that's not only in Europe, but across the board. So these are some of the myths that are being fostered. So what this suggests is that there are other, more compelling explanations. What we found is that the patterns of Islamist radicalization in Europe reflect the historical experience of European Muslim communities, and in particular, the links to their home countries. The prevalence of militant groups there and the extent to which factors of radicalization in Muslim countries transfer to European Muslim diasporas. So when we speak of homegrown terrorism, it's not quite an accurate term, because what we are seeing more often is this transfer of conflicts in the Muslim world to Europe, channeled by these diasporic ties between Muslim communities and their home countries. And this is why we find far greater levels of violent radicalization among communities of Pakistani ancestry in the United Kingdom, where there are established networks of Pakistan-based militant groups. Then, that's an interesting counterpoise to Germany, Then among the far larger ethnic Turkish population in Germany, which is far less integrated than the ethnic Pakistani community in the United Kingdom, we find very few incidents of ethnic Turks engaging in terrorism, although German authorities, and this is what Markus Kerbel and others told me, were concerned that the Turkish community is now showing incipient signs of radicalization. And so one of the questions is, are there structural reasons why this community is less susceptible, which I think is the case, or is it that they are lagging a generation behind, say, North Africans or ethnic Pakistanis? Then there is the case of the radicalization of the ethnic Somali communities in Northern Europe, the United States, Canada, and this again, I think it supports this argument of the diasporic ties, because before 2007, the Somali diaspora had shown very little signs of radicalization. In fact, we could not find any Somali militants in Europe before 2000. There was of course, the failed London bombing plot of July 21st, 2005. They were East Africans. Some of them claimed to be Somalis. They were not. They were from other countries, but they had gained asylum in the UK by claiming to be Somalis. So this phenomenon of this rapid radicalization of this community appears to be a consequence of the armed conflict in Somalia, and specifically of the Ethiopian occupation of Mogadishu from 2007 to 2009. And I was doing research. We published a book called small report, Radical Islam in East Africa, and I went to Somalia. And the Somalis were just beside themselves that the historic enemy had occupied the capital. And therefore, this facilitated the growth of Al-Shabaab, which was the main focus of resistance to the Ethiopians after the occupation, and the development of these networks in Europe, recruitment and logistical networks, and so on. And just as an aside, most of the Al-Shabaab introduced suicide bombing to Somalia, had not existed before. Most of the suicide bombers were not native Somalis. They were Somalis residing in the West who had traveled to Somalia to fight in the jihad. So, complicated. Now, prisons in Europe, as we do describe in some detail, are breeding grounds for Islamist extremism. We won't like to spend too much time since we're running short. But I interviewed Spanish prison personnel. By the way, it's very good interviews because they were not government appointees, so they would not be giving the official line. They were in fact members of the Spanish Prison Workers Union, and they were happy to tell me about all of the problems with the prisons. They were giving us a perspective of people on the front lines. They acknowledged that prison authorities don't have much control or even knowledge of what's going on in the prisons among the Muslim populations. They said Muslim inmates are in Spain and mostly Moroccans. Most are charged with drug trafficking in persons, or involvement in organized crime. They tend to congregate together and speak Moroccan Arabic that the prison authorities do not understand. They have contact with imams on the outside that bring them reading materials in Arabic that the authorities are unable to monitor. So this problem is a problem throughout Europe. The Quillian Foundation has published reports on prisons in the UK about militants taking over whole sections of the prisons. The Europeans have tried all sorts of different approaches, but have not found any satisfactory solutions. Some of these responses have backfired. For instance, the Spanish authorities, when they realized that the prisons were being used for radicalization and recruitment, they responded by dispersing radical inmates across prisons in Spain. And this had worked very well with the Basque terrorist organization ETA, because ETA used to control members in prisons by having them together. But this policy worked with ETA because ETA would only recruit Basques and did not try to proselytize. It backfired with the Islamics because they went out and of course they tried to convert other prisoners. Speaking of converts, we also look at converts. Turns out that converts to Islam are disproportionately represented in violent extremist groups. A key factor is the experience of conversion. Some convert directly to radical interpretations, Salafist interpretations of Islam, which can be a gateway to violent radicalization. Converts, in contrast to people who brought up as Muslims, tend to be largely poorly educated and have criminal or over-troubled backgrounds. They know very little about Islam when they're first introduced to the religion, and they lack a cultural context to filter out extremist rhetoric. So they're very vulnerable to recruitment, radicalization, and recruitment by radical groups. What our examination of terrorist incidents in Europe shows, however, is not just the radicalization of individual Muslims, but their incorporation into broad-ranging international conspiracies. And we do distinguish between radicalization and recruitment. I personally think that the concept of lone wolf terrorism is highly overstated, that it's not a major threat compared to the threat of attacks by organized group, like the one that attacked Charlie Hebdo. And in fact, when a terrorist incident took place in Europe, the first reaction of the media, the authorities, were to say, well, this is a group that did it on their own and they self-radicalized and so on. In fact, after some investigation, it turned out that most of these incidents had a linkage to a terrorist group someplace, usually in Pakistan. And in fact, for example, all of the individuals arrested in Germany in connection with a plot by the Islamic Jihad Union, which is an offshoot of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, to carry out bombing attacks against the US air base at Ramstein and other targets, had these linkages to Pakistan. There are linkages to Central Asia. And I want to mention that one of the most baffling connections between European jihadists and a non-European organization is the connection between German converts. This is the so-called German Taliban Mujahideen and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which is actually based in the tribal areas of Pakistan. The members of the German Taliban Mujahideen actually took their wives and children and established their own communities in the tribal areas. The idea is to get away from the sinful West and move to a place where they could practice pure Islam. There are links between European-based extremists and terrorist sanctuaries in Yemen and Somalia that I discussed. Since time is short, let me say a word about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Because with the growing threat of the Islamic State since June of last year when they took over Mosul, I think that we all, government and analysts alike, took our eyes off Al-Qaeda and focused on the Islamic State, the group that really had the momentum within the jihadi group. But what we are seeing now is a new dynamic within the jihadi camp that is defined by competition between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State for leadership of the global jihadist movement. And since the capture of Mosul, declaration of a caliphate, which is something Islamists have been trying to achieve since the 1920s, the Islamic State has been portrayed as a dominant jihadi enterprise. And what this has done is to create incentives for Al-Qaeda to restore its credibility by launching high-profile attacks against infidels. And so the Paris attacks, especially the killing of the Charlie Hebdo journalist, has to be seen in this context. And I identify about 3 or 4 different messages that this group tried to convey in the attack on Charlie Hebdo that I can discuss later. But again, Al-Qaeda is probably the greater threat at this point because it does have this global strategy, attacks against the far enemy, the whereas ISIS or the Islamic State seems to be focused on consolidating its control of areas that it has in Syria and Iraq. But nevertheless, there is the issue of the foreign fighters in Syria that I mentioned more than at any point during anti-Soviet jihad. And Syria is a very appealing destination for radicalized young Muslims, not only because it's the most prominent theater of conflict in the Muslim world, because of geographic accessibility and the relatively ease of travel. And I want to mention, we discussed this a bit in the book, because of the importance of Greater Syria in Islamist eschatology. And according to some hadith, the final battle between the Mahdi, I guess the Islamic Messiah, and the Islamic Antichrist, if I may use that term, would take place in Syria. And one of the differences between the Al-Nusra Front, which is the main Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and an Islamic State, is that the Nusra Front tends to have the messaging tends to be fairly conventional, but Islamic State has a very apocalyptic view, and there are discussions for example, in their media publication, Tabik, that talk about the end of the world and the signs are here. So that many of these foreign fighters, I suspect, I believe that they could be witnesses not just to the defeat of the infidel Assad regime, but also to the final triumph of Islam. So one quick, to end this quickly, because we're talking about responding to the growing threat of terrorism. What can be done to counter this threat? And after the terror attacks in Paris, there were all sorts of media queries as to what can be done, how can we respond to this, which I thought was a bit odd, because what have we been doing since 9/11 and since Paris, since Madrid and London? Because the Europeans and the West have been responding to this threat for at least a decade. I mean, there is nothing new, which what happened in Paris. And in fact, I think that we should not underestimate what the Europeans have tried to do to respond to the jihadist threat, which I think is far more comprehensive responses in many cases than what has been done in the United States. And so we describe the evolution of European approaches to counter radicalization and counter terrorism. In the book, the EU has sought to create an overarching counter-radicalization structure to try to improve cooperation among the different countries, even though there are very inherent limitations on what the EU can do as an institution, because resistance by national governments to transfer authority to the EU counter-terrorism office. European governments have developed their own counter-radicalization programs, most comprehensive being the PREVENT component of the British contest strategy. There have been efforts to address the problem of ostensibly non-violent extremist groups and to counter extremist ideologies. A very difficult thing to do in the context of Western legal systems. At one point, the dissemination of extremist ideas, but not actions themselves, become a crime. And Europeans are grappling with that. Efforts to engage interlocutors in the Muslim communities. How do you identify appropriate interlocutors? How you make sure your interlocutors are not actually Salafis, which used to be the case in the UK. And the introduction of more effective counter-terrorism legal tools. And this involves some controversial issues, such as granting the Security Services Authority to monitor the computers of suspected terrorists, and to collecting data from telecommunications companies and internet providers. Very controversial issues today, but that have taken greater prominence since the attacks in Paris. In short, the emphasis of European countries remain on prevention, improved intelligence, and community vigilance, and far more than I think the United States. They have really sought to address what they consider to be the root causes of radicalization. So, stop here.
Great. That was, yeah, even more depressing than I thought it would be. But Jack, I wondered if you want to pick up where he left off. If there's anything that stood out to you, but also I wonder if you could address the issue of the overall climate in Europe in terms of the economic malaise, the rise of nationalist movements within a lot of European countries, and how that might be creating a vicious cycle of confrontation between immigrant communities, migrant communities, and the rising right, if you will, in Germany. But whatever you care to touch on would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a lot of focus at the moment on demonstrations, for example, in Germany, on this Pegida development, which of course doesn't necessarily only have any kind of an anti-immigrant flavor to it. There's a lot more to it than that. I think every country is entitled to have its own Tea Party, and Germany has just gotten in. My sense is that what you're looking at in Europe in particular is what you started out with saying, is that the difference between the United States and Europe is the difference between immigration and integration. Obama recently was quoted in saying, you know, Islam is part of the U.S. Merkel has said that Islam is part of the U.S. The president of Germany, not the current one, but the one before him as well, said that Islam is part of Germany. The point I'm making is that I think that there's an assumption in this country where people come into the country and they become Americans, like you. In Germany, if you are in Germany for 30 years or 40 years, you're not necessarily German. You look different. And that notion of cultural integration is slightly different when you're dealing with the question of the conflicts currently in Europe. What is a German? That is an internal question. I would raise the issue that it is an internal question, was an American. But we have a real significant problem, I think, in Europe, and in Germany in particular, I would say, because the German wrestling with itself is an age-old issue. Let me just point out a couple things that I think are part of the fragmentation that you just mentioned. In other words, there are national movements, there are ethnic movements, there is a fraying in Europe at the moment that has to do with economic issues at its base. But it also has to do with the uncomfortableness that a lot of Europeans feel about the European project. I think that that's happened in the last 10 years, largely because of economic issues, but I also think there's a certain sense of perceived threat in Europe about where it's going. And there's no narrative to say what the next chapter of Europe is supposed to be. I think that there is a lack of leadership in Europe on that subject, leaving it to local populism, be it the Front National or be it the AfD in Germany or UKIP in England, where people can pick up on this stuff. And then the Islamic issue, the Islamic presence in that particular morass plays a role. So I don't think it's only Islamic threat. I think there's a lot more to it than that when it comes to understanding what people are afraid of in Germany or in Europe in general. Let me pick up on four things that you mentioned. The diaspora. I think that there is obviously a larger link in Europe of those immigrants, Muslim or not Muslim, but certainly in that case, to the home country. There are 5% of the population of Germany is foreign. Half of that is Turks. And there is a connection that does not happen in this country. When the premier of Turkey then, Erdogan, comes to Germany, thousands of Germans, Turks, and remember, a large number of Turks have German citizenship, turn out. When there's a game between Germany and Turkey on a soccer field, you see remnants of nationalism that are in competition with each other on the football field. So there is a link to the diaspora at home, which is very different in the United States. We did a study here, which I want to recommend to you all here at AICGS some years ago. And we talked about the main reasons for immigration. And it says among the Muslims in Germany, the main reasons were family reunion, There's a lot of people that have come in since 1961, 62, 63. Economic reasons, better life, obviously we share that, and conflicts at home. In the US, economic reasons, conflicts at home, and education. I think that the premise here is that people are linked to the diaspora in a way in Europe that they're not here, in the Muslim community. The second issue is the local issue, for example, of mosques. Cologne is building the largest mosque in Europe at the moment, outside of the one in Britain. And it's been a great point of friction in German society. You can double that if you go to Switzerland. So I think that the actual everydayness of integration is a problem, which, by the way, then links back to radicalization you mentioned before. The second issue is media presentation. I would say you've got to pay close attention to the way media presents these issues in Germany, but also elsewhere in Europe. I think that plays a major role. The third issue is a difficult one to get a hold of, and that's imams. Imams in Germany particularly were flown in from Turkey because of the half being Turks who did not speak German and had really no idea where they were. And in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, the Germans recognized that and have decided that they want to set up universities where imams must go before they start. In other words, to learn German society. This is new. So if you have that as a new novelty, then you have the old imams, some of whom are from the radical center, Salafists, if you will, coming in and contributing to the alienation issues that are perhaps already felt, especially in the younger generations. There's another issue which I think is important to remember, and to some extent it also mirrors the United States. If you look at the composition of the Bundestag, 630 people, it's a big parliament. There's only a handful of Muslims in it. So the role models are missing. The aspirations are missing. Where do you go if you are a 16-year-old Muslim Turk? Where do you aspire if you can't get a good education, if you can't get a break in the education system? There's an underclass problem here. And that also is related to, well, where do you go if you have an imam who's talking about fighting in Syria? I will just basically say that I think that there is obviously a increasing security concern in Germany. There's a trial going on right now in Düsseldorf of a young woman who was allegedly having supported her husband who went back to Syria. There, obviously, the Sauerland incident a couple years ago when people were trying to blow up the U.S. air base. There's obviously a real concern that what happened in London, what happened in Spain, and of course what happened just in Paris, could happen in Germany. It hasn't happened yet. But I think that there is a sense of fear and anxiety about it, and it's not just in Germany. And I think that that's the kind of thing that we have to speak to when you're talking about how do you get people to understand that they are stakeholders in the society in which they live. I think that what Obama was saying recently when Cameron was at the White House at a press conference, he said, we integrate our Muslims much better than you do. Little chutzpah there. But my sense is that there are people who are in the Muslim community. I mean, there's no single ethnic group in the United States that represents the Muslim community like they do in Germany. So there is competition within that group. There's also stakeholder mentality within that group. And I think that's one of the advantages that perhaps the US has, that Germany doesn't. So I think that this mix of things, the imams, the media, the local problems of how do you, if you live in a small Bavarian town, I mean, you travel around Germany, and you run into a huge big mosque there, it's a bit of a cultural adaptation, which you'll probably find somewhat similarly if you're in the middle of Kansas. And so I think that the issue is more, how do we deal with the ability to make stakeholders on both sides? It's a two-way street, and it's not working. And I think that the one thing that comes into that when it comes to the jihad sources is that when that doesn't work, when there's a vacuum, when especially among the younger people see that they are not becoming stakeholders, either in terms of role models or in terms of imams that support them, or just simply because of the fact they don't have an economic foothold, you have a tinderbox. And that's where we are.
Great. Well, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions around the table. One that immediately occurs to me for you both is, given the complexity of the issues we're dealing with, how do we measure success, either on the European or even on the U.S. side? I mean, how do we know if we're winning? Have we been lucky, in Germany, or have they done something better than others?
Yeah, let me share a couple of quick thoughts on that, and then I'll defer to my colleague. One way on the terrorism front, one way of defining success is the lack of attacks, or the lack of successful attacks. So in a way, if one, as I was saying, if one looks back at, say, the period after 2005, and say the Paris terrorist attacks, you could say that European counter-terrorism policy or approaches were successful in there were all sorts of plots. In Germany, there were several. There were almost annual large-scale plots in the UK after 2005, but they were all foiled. So that's one way of defining success. Success is a lack of terrorist attacks. Now, in terms of counter-radicalization, I think measuring success is much more difficult, because we wrote a report at RAND called De-Radicalizing Islamist Extremism a couple of years ago, 2010, and we looked in a fair amount of detail at European counter-radicalization programs. We look at the PREVENT program in the UK, we look at programs in the Netherlands, and so on. And generally, these programs involve reaching out to the communities, trying to identify young people at risk, staging interventions to prevent these young people from participating, moving on to violence. And the problem that we had is that we could not really, we did not find any effective measurements of, how can you measure whether a program is successful or not? And to do that, you'd have to have a control group, you have so on. That's not in place. So that in the end, we decided that you could not measure the success of these programs.
I think it's a simple, overly simplified answer, but you build stakeholders. And there are people in, might be this Germany, but there are stakeholders. You mentioned the Criminal Foundation in London, is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah.
Here's a guy who comes out of the system and then turns back and then is in the business of creating stakeholders in the society that you're in. We have a problem there of understanding how we expand the identity of people who can relate to the diaspora and at the same time say, I am a German. What is the current prevalent answer in Britain? And I always ask you this question. When you talk to a Muslim, is he a Muslim, or is she a Muslim, or is she, and then she's British? Or is it the other way around? I would maintain that in Germany, most people would say, if they had a German citizenship, they would probably say, first of all, I'm German, then I'm Muslim. I think that's the case, more so in Germany than it is in Britain, although I can't vouch for that. On the French side, I'd like to know that even more, because I think here, in contrast to Germany, you had the barrio-type situation outside of France, outside of Paris, where the compartmentalization of French society when it comes to Muslims is much greater than it is in Germany. So I think the answer, Bryce, is you build stakeholders, but you really role models. And one of the problems, one of the gaps in I think all through Europe, but certainly in the case of Germany, is the fact that the imams have this enormous influence, and if you don't have them integrated in society, then how the hell are they going to transfer that?
Great questions. That's all. Harlan?
I'm Harlan Ullman, thank you. I have a declaratory statement I'd like to rest manfully into a parliamentary question. On the one hand, you could argue that the Islamists could be a potential Leninist or Hitlerian sort of threat over time. On the other hand, some have argued that this could be like the hula hoop and of its own weight just disappear in the future. Though I'm inclined to the former, it may strike people as funny that when this country was most racked by terrorism and its concerns about terrorism from 1919 to 1920, after a series of bombings, killed one person with Red Scares and so forth. My question is this, and I ask in the context of having been on the SACEUR advisory board since just about after 9/11. NATO was obviously a very, very successful military alliance, the most successful in history dealing with its threat. But we don't have any equivalent to deal with this particular danger. We have codicils and international agreements for travel, air transportation, money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't even agree on a name for the Islamic State. Is it ISIL? Is it ISIS? Is it Daesh? Or is it the enemies of Islam? What would you suggest as a means of an international coordination or a European transatlantic coordination to deal with these dangers? Because, as you may or may not know, last week in London, 61 states got together for the first time in a counter-terrorist meeting, which really put in place some potential foundations that are still obviously very, very dormant, but can be developed. So I wonder what your ideas are on a much broader theme. Business Executives for National Security just put out a study on countering domestic terrorism last week, which said that there is no enterprise concept on the part of the federal government to deal with state and local agencies to deal with domestic terrorism, which I think is quite an interesting indictment. So what would you suggest as potential organizations, groups, structures to cope with these issues in a broader sense rather than on a national basis?
Well, a couple of quick thoughts on that. I think that the threat that's posed by present-day Islamist terrorism is a lot more, as you mentioned, like the anarchist violence of a sort of late 19th and 20th, early 20th century. And I'll ask in a moment Bill Rosenau to give us quick thoughts on this because he's an expert on the subject. So it's more like an amorphous anarchist movement than like the Soviet Union. There was a monolithic state-based threat. So while an institution like NATO was very appropriate to deal with the type of threat that the Soviet Union posed, it would be less so when confronting was essentially a network threat. That's the terrorist threat we face today. Now, obviously, there is a need for much greater intelligence cooperation, intelligence sharing. There is all sorts of problem with access to data, which is controlled in most European countries on a national basis, so that when, say, a French based terrorist moves into Germany, it's very difficult for the French authorities, or for anyone to follow the individual because of differences in the legal processes of and security approaches.
But you do that with Interpol.
Both countries. Well, it can be done to a degree, but there are some significant gaps. So rather than overarching structures, I think that what's needed is greater intelligence and data sharing. Now, the Islamist terrorist threat is really a network-based threat, and what a lot of people say is that you can only fight a network with a network. So that rather than overarching national or international level institutions to deal with that, I think it should be dealt with at a lower level. And in fact, I think that probably government-centered responses are probably wrong. That the way, in my view, to address what could be the sources of the problem is to engage Muslim communities through, say, building stakeholders. In fact, just to mention another book that very quickly, we also wrote a book back about 10 years ago called Building Moderate Muslim Networks. And the thesis of this book was that during the Cold War, the Soviet threat wasn't only a military threat, of course. The Soviets and their allies had developed institutions, unions, media, youth groups, student groups, and so on. So it was a very wide, broad type of challenge. And to confront that, we developed institutions, free labor unions, free media, and so on. And so that the AFL-CIO had a very significant role in confronting the Soviet threat on the labor front. So therefore, what we suggested is to take a page from the experience of the Cold War to identify and reach out to moderate Muslims and to build them as stakeholders, because the argument is that as non-Muslim majority countries, we don't have any credibility.
But we really haven't done that.
We haven't done it.
Why not?
We haven't had the political will to do that. I think there was some inclination on the part of some sectors of the Bush administration to do that. And just to give you one small example, during the Cold War, we had a very successful journal that analyzed the ideology, as it's called, Problems of Communism.
Of course.
And now, so I actually proposed to the Defense Department, why don't we establish a periodical called Problems of Islamism, and we base it in London, so it won't be a U.S. And then there you can analyze, bring in scholars, academics, experts, talk about the issues, so we could understand the type of challenge. That never happened. So we haven't done it. We did it then in the 50s. So I think that the answer is along those in that direction, not so much in international institution building.
Well, I would just say that in Germany, in that particular case, that's exactly what they did. They built the Islam Conference, and they were trying to reach out to the somewhat eclectic group of people under the umbrella of Islam. Very difficult to know how to do that, but they did that, and they basically, and my answer to you would be to build it from the bottom up, not from the top down.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, I mean, the fact is that you have to know that the actual radicalization starts in a mosque somewhere in southern Bavaria. It starts in Düsseldorf. It starts in Essen. Well, who is responsible for that? And and I agree with you on that as well, if you have the heavy hand of government coming in and saying, that has to be prevented, that's far less effective than if you have an effective imam saying, don't go there.
The problem with that is identifying the right interlocutors.
Sure.
You have to identify the right people, because what they did in the UK, which was very counterproductive, they selected Salafis to be the people associated with the Muslim Council of Britain. It's a Muslim Brotherhood type organization. You don't want these guys as your partners.
Stanley Cover. Let me follow up on the Cold War reference. When I was a student in the Soviet Union, once I had a conversation with some Soviet students. One in particular was praising Stalin lavishly. And listened to her and I said, fine. But didn't he also kill a lot of people? And she replied, yes, that's true, but what do you do with people who oppose the revolution? Of course you kill them. The problem with terrorism, it seems to me, isn't so much a sense of identity. It's the legitimation of murder. That doesn't have to be Islam. Why do people feel they are justified in killing, even mandated to kill? Today's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I don't know if any of you have seen Jacob Bronowski's BBC series. Remember the one, Knowledge or Certainty, where he stands at Auschwitz and says, this is what people do when they have the knowledge of gods. It is that certainty. I don't think this is a question. This transcends Islam. Why do some people feel they are legitimized in killing? Now, there's a saying from the Inquisition of opposition to it. I can't track it down. You don't burn somebody alive for disagreeing with you. That is a simple expression of civilization. That's the difference.
Boy, that's a long extent. I mean, you know, you're talking about the nature and destiny of humankind. I mean, I don't know how the hell you answer that. I mean, to some extent, I think that the ability to say that in the Quran there is no mandate to kill people is like saying there's no mandate to kill people in the book of Leviticus. You know, I mean, you can pick and cherry pick everything you want.
So why some people choose one and not the other?
I don't know.
That's, yeah.
Well, let me
Christianity calls it original sin.
Let me add to that. I mean, actually, it's a very difficult to answer. I mean, we could use some philosophers to come here.
That's what I was just. Well, Stan is a
But
philosopher.
I was making an observation that one of the characteristics of Islamist groups of Islamists of any kind, terrorists and non-violent as well, is that everything that they do, including the violence, has to be justified scripturally. So the terrorists, I mean the Al-Qaeda, the other groups, they have theological justification for what they do.
Which they pre-selected.
Yes, and they what they do is before they have their imams, you know, their religious scholars. Their religious scholars issue the justification for the violence based on scripture. And you know, as you say, I mean, you can always cherry pick from any particular set of scriptures, and there is plenty of support for violence in the Quran and the Hadith. I mean, there's an enormous amount of justification. I mean, to say that you know that the Quran doesn't justify violence is ridiculous. I mean, it depends on what you choose to pick. I mean, you could pick verses that support, you know, toleration, and you support verses that support violence. In fact, the Quran itself is it's very schizophrenic, because
Most religious tracts are.
yeah, there are two parts of the Quran, and you know, one was written in Mecca when Muhammad was very much under pressure by his enemies, and those are the peace verses, and they you know, they tended to justify tolerance and so on. And then he moved to Medina, and then where he took over and established. And in Medina, that's where the war verses were given, that very bloodthirsty in a way. Some of that, I mean, there is the event in Medina of the extermination of the Jewish community in Medina, which had originally supported Muhammad. So that there is plenty of support for violence in the Quran. That's when people say, and this is a controversial statement, it's kind of a maybe subjective view, people say that the radicals or the terrorists have hijacked Islam. That's false, because the radicals can find as much support for their position as the moderates. It's not to say their position is stronger, but they can find verses. The Saudis have a way of analyzing this, of reconciling these differences, they say. They call it abrogation, and what that means is that a later verse in the Quran that's inconsistent with an earlier verse abrogates the earlier, so that they use abrogation to support a more violent interpretation, because generally the latter verses tended to be more violent, whereas moderates tend to find support in the earlier verses of the Quran. So it's not a simple question, and it's a matter of how you select your particular scriptural support, which I suspect is the same in every religion.
Precisely.
So I think we have at least two questions here. I want to get this side too. Maybe we'll do 4 or 5, and we can pick and choose. We have one right here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Pereira, Office of Secretary of Defense Policy, and it's great to be in these sessions where you have the chance to inhale so many good ideas that then are not necessarily difficult to put in practice, but in the grand scheme of things become a little bit more difficult. I was struck by your comment on recent perpetrators of violence as in integrated Muslims in Europe. Simply because I think we're misunderstanding the word integration. I think, as the gentleman said, after you basically being integrated in the United States is completely different from being integrated in Europe. Yes, they might have had a job, some salary, 2,000 to 3,000 euros a month, but they were discriminated at the coffee shop. They are discriminated in a restaurant, they were discriminated at an airport, a local airport, not necessarily international airport, and that's what's not happening in Europe. The second point that I'd like to make is, maybe it's easier for us right now to deal with the policy side, talk about intel